Well, good morning if you are somewhere out near the Pacific Ocean, at least on the North American side. Good afternoon if you're somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean on the North American or South American side. Good evening if you're on the Atlantic Ocean near Europe or Africa. And greetings to people all around the world who follow me on iDadjo. I'm Fred Plotkin. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on iDadjo, the place where classical music happens. As you know, iDadjo is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. Today is October 18th of 2024, and I have two wonderfully, fertily creative guests. I have a composer and I have a librettist, but they're a lot more than just saying a composer because she also writes libretti. I have a librettist who's also an author, a journalist, a critic. Let's just say two very creative people who I've admired for a long time, and they are joining forces on a new opera called Lucidity that will have its world premiere in New York City on November 14th. They are composer Laura Kaminsky and librettist David Cote. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you.
So I'm trying to think where to start because both of you have a lot of wonderful work behind you before you join forces for this particular project, Lucidity. Maybe I'll start with that. How did it come to pass that you joined forces? Who initiated the idea and who sought the other one out to form a team?
Well, I mean, it would go back about 10 years when I saw Laura's opera As One at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which was October 2014, I think it was when it premiered.
September.
Okay,
Yep.
September. Close. So, and that, of course, was an opera about a transgender experience based on co-librettist Kimberly. Kimberly. Sorry.
Reed.
Yeah. Her experience. And I was just struck by the beauty of the music and the mix of humor and pathos of the piece. And I said, I want to work with Laura. Of course, As One has gone on to be produced how many times around the US and the world?
64, I think, thus far.
Yeah. So, I mean,
I understand it's the most produced opera composed in the 21st century in the 21st century.
I believe that's true, but maybe Lucidity will break that. We'll see. And I first encountered David through his gorgeous opera Scarlet Ibis, which was what year, David?
That was January 2015.
Yeah, so it was within a short period we became quite aware of each other. And it took a while till we got to know each other and resolved to make something together. And that took a long time to figure out what we were going to make. Right, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think the watchword was always find something that's really personal to you, which this piece is, even though it charts territory. It's a mix of personal and new experiences for me. But yeah, I mean, should I say how the idea sort of germinated? The initial idea? Yeah. Well, I mean, it was very chance encounter with a violinist I knew on the subway. We crossed going to our various trains, and I asked her where she was going, and she was going to somebody's house to play for them, a sort of private concert in their home. And she said it's part of a program called Music and Medicine. And so this person she was playing for had dementia, and the idea was to improve the quality of life, and it was a form of music therapy. So I suddenly had this flash of an idea: a musician, an elderly person, and perhaps that person's caregiver. And that triad of people attracted me. Like, what's going on? How do these people influence each other's lives? And so there was just a human situation that I wanted to dramatize, and I brought that to Laura.
And Laura, what did you respond?
Well, I think what was happening at that whole period when David came with that specificity of that encounter was that we had been really seeking a story to tell for a while. And as David said, it was important to us as we got to know each other that we were dealing with things that had relevance emotionally for us, that we could tell it from a place of truth, but we weren't going to tell by our biographies. So we were sort of searching, like, well, what are the things that we care about? And that led to a lot of conversation about healing and therapy and loss and caregiving, because we were both going through situations like that. But I brought another piece of the puzzle to David, which helped create the story that we made up, which is that I was determined to write an opera for the soprano Lucy Shelton, who was then in her late 70s. I had convinced her to produce a 75th birthday concert of her favorite repertoire with her favorite artists at Merkin Concert Hall in New York City. And it was one of the most joyful, beautiful experiences that all of us in this full house encountered. And Lucy and I had become friends over many years. I mean, we worked together like over 30 something years, and we became Scrabble buddies. And I would go to her house to play Scrabble. And one day I went expecting to have a cup of tea and play a game of Scrabble. And Lucy said, "So what are you working on these days?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on my next opera after As One." She said, "Oh, what's it about?" I said, "Well, I happen to have the draft of the score with me." And she said, "Could I take a look?" Well, we never played Scrabble. She read through the entire score at sight and had amazing comments and critique for me. And so it became a kind of a regular thing that I would share my works in progress with her. And then one point she said, "So when are you going to write something for me?" And it was sort of like a joke, but that stuck. And so I brought it to David. Well, if we're going to deal with somebody with dementia, could you imagine writing it for a singer who is about to turn 80? Well, she was in her late 70s when we came upon the idea, but will probably be about 80 when the piece premieres. And he was game. And that was how the character of Lily specifically was born. It was written for a particular person.
And I had, of course, I knew Lucy's work in the past. I actually had dated the clarinetist with Da Capo chamber players, a Pierrot ensemble, I guess is what it's called, in New York. And so I saw Lucy perform Pierrot Lunaire at least a couple times. And so
yeah, me too.
That piece was new to me at the time, and it was just haunting. And I feel like hopefully we're not getting ahead of ourselves here, but the music that Laura has written for the character of Lily, Lucy's character, is a remarkable mixture of pure soprano, beautiful, contemporary bel canto, I guess you'd say, or just soprano vocal writing, but also Sprechstimme, and there's spoken bits. It's a beautiful mixture of styles which reflect her various mental states in the show, in the opera.
And which is specific to Lucy as a performer, because she has embodied all of that theatricality with both the most pure, beautiful voice, but with this great ability to act as well.
Who are the other characters in the opera?
There's Dr. Claire Klugman, who is played by mezzo-soprano Blythe Gessert. And she is conducting the music therapy trial that Lily takes part in. There's Sunny, who is a young clarinetist pursuing her PhD. Am I getting that terminology right? It would be a PhD, right?
DMA, probably.
And then there's Dante, who is Lily's adoptive son, who is her caregiver as well, and a former pianist who sort of gave up that life when he had to take care of his mother, but also he had a lot of frustration with the field. As a Black pianist, he found a lot of resistance, prejudice, lack of opportunity. And the character.
Is there any reason he's named Dante?
I think a lot of the names are related to light in various ways. And Claire, Sunny, Lily's just Lily, lovely flower. And I thought Dante is going on a journey, into darkness, into the light. So I think that was a sense of it for me. He's on a journey.
I ask because the most famous line out of the author poet Dante Alighieri, he speaks of the mezzo cammin della vita. In other words, he's halfway through his life's journey.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of what I understand this opera to be about, that he's caring for someone, he's halfway through his life's journey, caring for someone who's in the later stages of her life's journey.
Mm-hmm.
Did that enter the creativity at all?
I mean, of course, that he was on a journey was definitely, foremost in my mind, and that he was encountering darkness, and he was in a darkness of his own, lost in a dark wood, I suppose. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting piece because it's sort of like, even though Lily is sort of the central character and everybody orbits around her, it is really an ensemble piece, with every character having their own arc through it. And another piece of backstory about the story, we find out, I guess this is just spoilers, perhaps, but with Claire, the neuroscientist who's conducting this music therapy study and working on a book about it, she used to be a singer. So she has this past with Lily as her teacher, but it's one of these teacher-student relationships that is loving, but also they've become estranged over the years. And so there's this trepidation about reuniting with her.
And the other
yes.
piece about Lily is that not only was she a voice teacher, but she was a composer, hence Lily, as in Lily Boulanger, I suppose, a nod to that. But in her day, there were just not very many opportunities for women as composers. So she had a room full of scores, I mean, shelves full of her scores, many of which had never seen the light of day. And a discovery around that is a piece of this storytelling that David so ingeniously wove together.
Dementia as a word is a very big word and can be all-encompassing, and it's not necessarily specific. We understand it to be a description of a whole series of conditions that a person, usually but not necessarily older, may experience. And therefore, in creating a character, writing music for that character who has dementia, and then finding the performer who will do it, there's a whole spectrum. I hate the word in this context, but you know what I mean. There's a whole spectrum of choices that can be made about how to depict, how to present this character and her relationship to the other people. And I ask this specifically in the context of, you mentioned that there was a student-teacher relationship here. And sometimes people with dementia are lucid, and I'm going to ask you more about the title, and sometimes they often go into repeat patterns of memory about certain things that they fix on and need to sort through and maybe come to peace with. And because I've not heard the piece yet or read the libretto or looked at the score, I don't know anything about it except I'm talking to the creators. But I'll be interested to see, as you start rehearsals, whether it evolves as sometimes the character Lily is more interactive and perhaps reverts to the role of being the teacher rather than dealing with someone who's a doctor. And maybe this is a spoiler you don't want to spoil, but I'm interested whether you factored that in, that so-called dementia is really a whole spectrum of potential dramatic choices and musical choices.
May I jump in on that, David?
Please.
So one of the things that was important to me in the early conversations with David about the sensitivity around creating a character with dementia was that we wanted to make it clear that this was somebody in the early stage of dementia who was fully aware of what was going on and was beginning to have lapses in clarity and memory, but was cognizant and mentally robust. And so that was a different place in this, horrific journey that can lead to real loss of self, because we wanted her to not be babbling or screaming or non-communicative. We wanted her to be engaged thoughtfully in all of the storytelling that we did. So that was one kind of ground rule that we set, was that Lily was early stage and knew who she was. But to your really astute question, there is a moment in a beautiful scene with Sonny where Sonny comes to play for her, and there's a leitmotif through the piece, which is Shepherd on the Rock by Schubert, which is a song for soprano, clarinet, and piano. And Lily interrupts Sonny and asks her, well, what's this song about? And we get a beautiful text from David that sort of clarifies all of the metaphors around the piece. And at the end, Lily takes on the teacher role and goes, very good. You get an A+ for that. So she still has that capacity, but then in the middle of something, she can get confused. And then she uses humor often to make her way out of the embarrassment or the frustration. And then there's sweet memories as well as momentary in the present anger, anguish that David has woven so beautifully, so that she's not a stock character or caricature, that she's really fully dimensional. And so I fell in love with her from reading the way that David crafted her. So I'm hoping that our audiences will too.
It's the story sort of, I guess, it reaches its climax in a very musical moment with Lily performing a song from a cycle called Chosen Son, which was inspired by Dante in the early weeks of having adopted him. And I think that's where you really see Lily. The music has really brought about some changes in her life, and she's back to work revising it and performing it for the group. And of course, it has a very deep emotional impact on Dante as well, whose relationship with his mother is loving, but also strained by the difficulty of caregiving, and caregiving for a woman with a very strong personality. I don't want to use the D word, but she's
and as you gave Dante a great line, which he said, the only gene I inherited from her is the diva gene, because he's got a bit of it himself.
Right.
Well, actually, I want to get to that. You mentioned in passing something that I thought I did understand, and I did, but I didn't want to bring it up. Because one character is white, the other is black, unless the father was of color in some way, that he might have been adopted. And I'm not going to name her. There's a very, very famous opera singer who I've worked with a lot, who was adopted. And she adopted her own children rather than give birth to them. And I knew her father. I noticed that the issue of music in that family was particular, because the singer did not inherit from the father or mother the musical genes, the whatever may have come genetically that made her one of the greatest singers in the world. But then she similarly did not genetically pass that down to her children, who frankly were completely unreceptive to music. And it was very interesting to watch, because this was their mother's job, but they didn't have any attachment to them. I'm not judging them, but they went off just in other directions completely. And mom went to work, and their father was not in the music world, but he was sort of a manager for the family. And what struck me is that in the absence, there was not the nature of music, there was the nurture of music, but it didn't take. And this particular singer found her own way into it when she discovered as a very young girl that she had a splendid voice and was sent to the right place to learn how to sing. And she's very famous. I'm not naming her, but she had one of the greatest careers of the 20th century. And I'm interested to know, David, particularly, is there resonance for you in any particular way on this?
Well, adoption is definitely something that I'm interested in as an adoptee myself. I mean, not in a family where there's any racial difference. I was born and adopted in New Hampshire. I guess I've just always been interested by the extraordinary emotional situation or possibilities that affords, and how it becomes almost an existential question of who am I? Am I the person I was? Am I the person I was always going to be, or have I been sort of, have somebody poured, their wine into this vessel, or something like that? I mean, Edward Albee, of course, made a whole career out of writing about the existential dilemma of the adoptee, and whether am I real, am I fake? Is my family real or fake? It's not an opera about adoption per se, but it's definitely a thread in the piece, and it ends with a really lovely act of reconciliation. But I would say also family bonding or lack of bonding is a theme. Sonny, the young clarinetist in the story, is a bit. When the opera starts, she's been estranged from her parents for several months because of a pregnancy that she terminated the year before. She couldn't have that in her life at the time. And so I think because we suggest the parents are very religious, they object to it. So it's about families that are sort of finding their way back to each other in part as well.
It's also part of why Sunny made the decision she made was that she was determined to get her doctorate, and she couldn't imagine being a young single mother, although there was some boyfriend at the time, but raising a child and pursuing the career. And she felt it had to be a either or situation. And there's a very poignant scene between her and Lily when she reveals her truth to Lily, and Lily says, "Why do you think you couldn't do both? I did." And the whole notion of making a family, choosing a family, getting a family, eschewing a family runs across all these characters, which we also experience with Dr. Klugman, because Claire was an aspiring singer who, for whatever the reasons are, came to the realization she didn't have what it took and went to her second love, which was science. And she has an ex-husband, and her family wasn't understanding her decisions in her life, and she's struggling. But then, of course, Lily was kind of, her mentor. So in a way was a mother figure, a nurturer for her. And then she was estranged from her because she felt like she let her down by going into science. So all these threads keep running into, well, what is it? The warp and the weft. They keep getting intertwined in different ways. And each time another piece of the story is revealed, we get another insight into these essential questions. How does one live as an artist? How does one live as a caregiver? What do you do as you realize your options are running out? How do you reconcile? How do you go forward? I mean, there were just a lot of same kinds of questions asked across all the four characters to different ends.
I asked the question about adoption for another reason as well. That I know of another family, not the singer's family, where it's blended through divorce and things like that, so that one person of the children's generation is in the bloodline of the person who has cognitive impairment. The other two are not. Let's call them stepchildren, but therefore not genetically linked to the person with cognitive impairment. The person who is the natural issue, genetically linked, thinks differently about issues of mental illness than do the ones who are not, because they don't feel they may, quote, get it through genetics. And adoption poses issues and challenges about who I am, as David correctly and eloquently said, but also, in a way, now be interested to see how Dante behaves and sings and so on, in that he is not genetically linked to Lily. I don't know if you explored that in the opera or whether in the music it may come out, as so much does in music.
I feel like in terms of his own health or his own future, I don't think he necessarily expresses an opinion about that. It certainly is, yes. Again, as an adoptee, I'm a little bit in touch with my birth mother, who's in good health. But you always wonder, like, what's in store for me? What's inside of me and growing, not to sound gruesome. But Dante, no, I think he mainly everyone's blocked. Everyone has some sort of block in the opera, and so his is, of course, having the very difficult relationship a caregiver can have with their loved one. Sometimes, not that it always happens, but Lily wants Dante to go back to playing. She wants him to live his life. Don't sacrifice your life for me. And he takes that as he says in the opera, as a slap in the face, I think. I'm trying to care for you, and don't negate the care I'm trying to give you. So they have a bit of an argument in the second scene of the opera in front of the clarinetist. So it's a bit awkward. Yeah, sort of airing their grievances a bit there. And yeah, so I would say that I don't. Maybe I'm answering the question. I don't know.
No, you are. You're actually bringing to mind someone who's a dear friend of mine. You may know him. I'm not going to name him. Who is an adoptee. He's a fantastically fertile, creative writer. He produces vast amounts of wonderful books and articles, and at a super high level. And he was adopted, as was his sister. And he learned that not his sister, but he is of Italian background. His family that raised him most definitely is not of Italian background. And he feels connected in a way to a more Latin culture than what he was raised with. He also has to contend with mental illness in that family. Again, not DNA, but how it's affected his life as a creative person, as a self-employed person, but also as someone who grew up in that family and landed in it. And it's a challenge for him, not just for caregiving purposes, but for self-understanding as a creative artist. And I mention this not because I expect an answer, but just because in thinking about the dynamics that you pose in the way the opera is structured, it sounds incredibly rich. And I mean, I'm going on November 15th. I can't wait. I'm bringing along someone who specializes in cognitive care and caregiving as a profession. And I'll be interested to hear his responses to it. He does it professionally, but now he's also doing it personally, so that it should definitely be very, very moving. I have a question for both of you. Did either of you see an opera called Sky on Swings that premiered at Opera Philadelphia in 2018? The composer is Lembit Beecher.
Lembit Beecher.
Yes. And Hannah Muscovich was the librettist. And it was a chamber opera about two women played magnificently by Frederica Varnstad and Marietta Simpson, who are, I don't want to give too much away because it's an opera people may see, are further advanced in their cognitive issues and Alzheimer's in the case of one of them. Again, we're not doctors here, but we have to remember that not everybody with dementia has Alzheimer's. Dementia is a bigger category. But it's an opera about memory loss, and the music evokes that. But what struck me particularly in that opera, and this was not written into it so I can say it, is not only what one loses with this experience, but what one gains. And one character of the two didn't realize that she was gaining anything, and for her it was a torment, but the other one did. And they form a particular bond because they're living in a facility where they're both being cared for, but because they're in different stages of Alzheimer's, they experience their lives very differently. And the music expressed it so beautifully, the libretto as well. Laura, you said that the character of Lily is in the early stages of her dementia. So I think that kind of answers the question about her ability to communicate and feel and express. But therefore, people have seen Sky on Swings this will be a very different experience from that.
Yes, I think one can safely say that that's
Yeah.
true. And that was a very powerful piece.
Yeah.
So, and I
Yeah,
think it's gone on to have a bit of a life, which is good.
Yeah. David?
I'm just curious. I mean, I didn't see it, I'm afraid. I knew it happened. What did one person find? What good thing did she find in the experience?
I'll say that what I found as the audience member in tears watching her, it was the character was the one played by Federica Manchata. That she still had the ability to love, that she found renewed love for a new person who could not quite understand the one played by Marietta Simpson, this affection and this compassion, but it renewed in the von Stade character a sense of purpose and connection. And, there's a very famous story of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who left the Supreme Court of the United States because her husband was being cared for with Alzheimer's, and she wanted to be with him and help him. At a certain point, he forgot who she was, and in fact formed a bond with another person where he lived. And this can happen sometimes. And so Sandra Day O'Connor gave up her important position on the Supreme Court, the first woman justice in the United States, to care for her husband, and then he didn't even know who she was. But the husband apparently found where he lived a new person to connect to. And obviously I didn't see that situation. But what was so beautifully done in this Sky and Swings is the von Stade character could connect. She's such an empathic, caring artist anyway that she was perfect for the role. But then you saw the anguish side of Marietta Simpson, who did not in any way overact. She really played it magnificently, of someone who didn't know what was going on and was just very much in the moment. It sounds like a cliche, but she was in the moment because she didn't remember the previous moment.
Right.
Therefore, it was an ongoing right now, no future, no past.
Well, we're very much, in a similar way going for, obviously, well, it's music that drives everyone's sort of passions in the opera, and it's what unites them in the end. And it's interesting that, again, I don't think we're spoiling anything too much, but the thing that I really wanted to establish at the end, besides the sense of union and reconciliation that happens for all four characters around the singing of that final song, is that Lily still has an acknowledgement of the darkness ahead. And it's not an aria, but it's an arioso, perhaps a small moment where she's like, I'm still scared, or she expresses words to that effect. And it's not there, and it's a sort of acknowledgement that music therapy isn't a cure-all. It's not a panacea for people suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. It can create moments of clarity, moments, and it can improve communication skills. There's a story, I want to bring in Renee Fleming in her book Music in Mind, which came out this year. There's an essay in it by Dr. Conchetta Tamaino, who did a wonderful post-show panel with us after a workshop in April, and she recounts a story about her research in music therapy of playing I think guitar for a man who was in a nursing home suffering from dementia, who had for a long time not been able to recognize his wife. And so Connie was playing guitar and he was improving from it. And then one day he turned to his wife and says, "Oh, Mary, there you are. Where have you been? I've been looking for you." And of course, it was a tremendously moving moment for the wife. And so I guess we're trying to be honest about what music therapy is and what it can do for people.
I mean, I think that, oh, I'm sorry. I just was going to add to something that David just said so poetically, which is that the piece really deals with sort of the mysteries of the heart, but behind it is this big mystery, which is how does the brain work and the connection to music and the mind that, underscores this. We're not providing a science lesson at all in this piece. It's a metaphor. And it's a sad truth that so many of us are going to confront dementia either by suffering with it or caregiving or losing someone. That's just a reality as we live longer, and we're seeing that this is just affecting more and more people. But there's these two levels of mystery in the piece, which is, how does this happen? Like, what does it spark? And how does it also open a heart?
When I began this program, Fred Plotkin on Fridays, it was during the worst part of the pandemic. It was April 24th of 2020, and I've done a show every Friday since then. So I'm past 230 shows by now. And I realized as I'm speaking with both of you that even early on, I started dealing with the issues of and choosing guests who could address memory, Alzheimer's, palliative care and music, which is to say someone who may be dealing with cancer or pain rather than a brain cognitive issue, not to mention emotional issues. And early on, and I've not mentioned this since I did it, but I think I can certainly talk about it now. I had as my guest Eugenia Zuckerman, who was a great flutist, became a wonderful arts correspondent for CBS News for some 25 years. And I used to like watching her broadcasts because she was great. And then I noticed that she wasn't on anymore. And I contacted a friend at CBS and learned that she had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and had retired. And I got in touch with someone who connected me with her. I learned that she had just published a book of poems and that she was in early Alzheimer's and therefore was a functioning person who had this diagnosis. And people who may have wanted to work with her professionally sort of backed away. And I thought, well, I think it's very important that I be in touch with her. And I had her on this program. We did a shorter program because I didn't know how long her stamina would last. Her husband sat with her, but though not on camera. And I asked her to bring her flute. And if she was in the mood to play her flute, if she was in the mood to read a poem. And she did a wonderful job. Unfortunately, we had bad weather that day. The Zoom connection was not so good, and it threw her a bit. But I invite people to go back. You can go on YouTube or iDodjo and write Fred Plotkin, Eugenia Zuckerman. And that would be the first example I've had of working with someone directly live, and having her express about that, because I realized that apart from anything else, she was confined not by the illness, but by people's perception of how she would be with that illness. And it's a very important distinction to make. And since then, I've had a guitarist whose name, unfortunately, I don't remember right now. He's based near Bethesda, and he works with the National Institutes of Health. And I've had professors from Mount Sinai, from Peabody, and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And periodically, I try to have people on who'll talk about the music-mind relationship. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor, but we know that there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for, let's call it executive function, and then musical memory and musical function. And I have been with people who were musicians by profession, who even as they lost most everything of their memory and their ability to function, if I sang a line from an opera, including the lyric, they tended to be able to sing back the whole aria. Because the lyric and the music hooked in. That to me is endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm reading Daniel Levitin's new book about I think it's called There Is a Secret Chord, which is about.
He's an upcoming guest of mine. Yes.
Oh, well, when you do meet him, tell him I've read all his books and he's
All right.
kind of a hero. I was a psychology major in college, not a music major. So this whole thing about how the brain works has long been a fascination for me. But one of the things he writes about is the fact that music uses more parts of our nervous system, of our brain, than any other human activity that we engage in. So it's like the likelihood that something would be sparked is greater because there's more things firing at the same time. And it is true that, when you see people with dementia who are given a musical clue to something that they knew, they're right there and they know every word, they can sing along, and it is often mood changing.
Yep.
It's the subject, of course, is just immediately furnishes wonderful metaphors that we exploit in the opera of hidden doors, bridges, of course, coming out of darkness into light. This whole notion that there's areas of the brain that dementia and Alzheimer's don't necessarily destroy, and that survive in hiding or something, and can be brought out, is wonderfully evocative and mysterious, and also, I mean, the idea that there are people who go through life and music is very important to them. They have special songs that have deep emotional meaning, and then of course there's a whole class of people who make music, write it, play it, sing it. And there's a difference, I think. Connie, this music therapy researcher, she did mention there's a difference between these two types of people. I mean, you can still get wonderful effects on people using music, live music usually, but with like piano players, singers, there's a muscle memory, I think, that's also at work there that gets activated when they're prompted with music. So it's really hardwired into their brain and body in many ways. And yeah, I was going to say something along the lines of, and we as people, as artists, as people in the world of art, we know that it's good for you. It's good for your health. And that's a message I think that Renee Fleming is spreading with her book, that it's not just that music is pretty, but it also is, quantifiably good for you, as well.
Yeah. In the new book by Daniel Levitin, there's a thing about music as like, why can't we prescribe it? And he sort of gives these sort of absurd, but potentially down the line real story, which is the patient calls the doctor and says, "Doctor, I'm really in pain and these are my symptoms." And the doctor says, "Take 2 aspirins and listen to 4 Joni Mitchell songs and call me in the morning."
Laura, you bring to mind something I did not thought about for a long time. A number of years ago, I was in Istanbul. I was working and I had an afternoon off, and I went for a walk in the old neighborhood called Sultan Ahmet. And there's the famous bazaar, the market. And I went in briefly, but I decided that's where everybody goes. Let me walk in the streets. And there was a sloping hill all the way down. And I entered a shop that had all kinds of stringed instruments in the window, because it was a musical instrument store. And that, of course, would attract me the way a bakery attracts me too. It's the same sensation. And I went in, and I think our common language was French, if I recall, because they didn't speak English. And we spoke about the instruments, we spoke about music in Turkey and so on. And then he said, "Do you know that music can be very therapeutic?" And I said, "I do." He said, "Look at this wall." And I have cassette tapes and I have compact discs. And it's alphabetized in Turkish by medical conditions. So that if you have X, if you have gastritis, if you have chronic headaches, if you have tooth pain, if you have, you name it, high blood pressure, we have the music for you. And as you hear me coughing, I have asthma. And so I said, let's take the asthma music. And I bought it, sight unseen. It was not expensive. And I cannot say that it cured my asthma, but I will say that when I put it on every so often, the lungs, there's a sense of bronchodilation. They relax. And I find that very interesting. And I'm not saying that we can automatically prescribe different kinds of music, like going to the pharmacy for different conditions. But yeah, I think there's also something to it.
And that phenomenon of that I guess has been actually verified that collectively an audience sitting at a performance that their heart rate drops, that they sort of relax into this sort of collective aesthetic experience, which I find wonderful.
And I think that we learned not only does it drop, but that at a certain point it comes to a mean where most people's hearts are beating the same. So, and that's what we call the shared experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is why I always prefer opera to seeing it, listening to it on a video or something like that. Live arts performance is unquestionably the best. Laura, in choosing how to score this opera and what instruments to choose, what entered your thinking?
There was this, it's so funny. I never know that I really think about anything. There are like these moments of flashes that it's like, oh yeah, that's right. And then I go with that, and then that reveals the next thing. So I'm not quite sure how this came, but I knew that there was a beautiful recording that Lucy had made, Lucy Shelton, when she was quite young, probably about 40 years ago, with David Gollop and David Schiff and playing Schubert's Shepherd on the Rock. And I was a very bad musician as a young person. I was a bad clarinetist and a bad pianist, but I played that piece, both parts, badly, in my lifetime. But I remembered that Lucy had this recording, and there was just something that hit me like, you know what? We knew this was going to be a chamber piece, similar for me to writing As One, which was essentially a monodrama for two voices playing one part. I knew that the instrumental ensemble had to be small and unified, which is why it's a string quartet. This piece, to me, has that same kind of intimacy. And we started, as we were developing our story and our characters, it's sort of like one day it all came as a piece that the Shepherd on the Rock music would be a leitmotif through the piece, because it goes back, and David wove beautifully into the libretto how that piece was important for Lucy. But so that made it clear that we needed a piano and a clarinet. So that was the beginning. And then the next question always is the budget of the commissioning companies, how many other instruments they're going to be able to manage, and then secondary to how much it costs, what is the staging expectation, whether the instruments will be in a pit or on the stage, and what kind of acoustic. So all of that sort of starts swirling around, and we kind of came up with a decision that there would be small strings, violin, cello, piano, clarinet, and then percussion, one player. So it's a very intimate configuration. But the one thing that I did know, and this was a kind of a complication in the world of opera, which is the expectation is that you create a score for learning the piece that's just the piano part. And I knew from the moment David got why we were including the Shepherd on the Rock motif, there was no way that just a pianist alone was going to be able to cover the multiplicity of musical line, because the clarinet in effect becomes kind of a character, as does the piano. And Sonny is the clarinetist and Dante is a pianist. So we were able to get an agreement that the score would be, for learning the piece, would be clarinet and piano only. And then I created another version that can be performed in that way, in case we really have such an intimate space that we couldn't put, a bunch of percussion instruments in the room. So this is a pretty flexible piece in that regard, but it is sort of like, I just hear it. I mean, I'm a very inefficient composer in that I I'm a visual composer, so I have to see it. So when David wrote that first draft of the libretto, I read it and I start to believe the words, but I can see it being played out in front of me. Like I've already staged it, which is very problematic when you get a stage director and they didn't see what I was imagining. But I see it in my mind's eye, and then it's all around color, and the color turns into the instruments and it tells me what it is. And so I write full score and then have to create a piano reduction, as opposed to many composers who just write a piano part and then after the workshopping and everybody agrees this is the structure of the piece, then they sit down and make the orchestra part. I work backwards. So I hear every note belonging to the instrument or instrumental combination playing it. I don't hear just the structural use of those pitches in a piano. So that was a long-winded
David, when you write
answer.
a libretto, David, when you write a libretto, do you hear music or instruments in the words that you write, or the very specifically words and how they have vowels or consonants, and whether that factors into the word choice you make?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say though that I hear music. I hear the music of the words and their particular rhythms and whether they're accelerating or decelerating. I'm always astonished by what composers do and how they transform this into music. But I do believe in the initial musicality of language. I believe that, of course, informs the actual vocal line. I would say that I don't necessarily write visually, although as a theater person, I you see the scene and you see the bodies on stage and the energies that they're giving off. I see patterns, often patterns of words or of images. I work a lot in patterns. I think like there's a thread of obviously light and dark is a big metaphorical thread throughout. Yeah, but of course you do think about vowels. You think and our names ending with vowels because that can work nicely. And of course it's an art of concision, libretto writing. Less is more. And as I always say, the best composers are the best editors. So Laura had tremendous input into the libretto, of course. I mean, as composers always should. Unless they're happy, they can't set it. But she had suggestions for lines and how to shape characters. So it was truly a collaboration on every level.
If I could just speak to that, Fred, I think one of the things that's the most joy for me in making a piece is that discovery with the librettist. And I know that there are librettists who hand the full libretto over, and then the composer 10 months later hands the full score in. And that's not, to me, that's so isolated and lonely, because the amount of questioning and discovery and rethinking that happens when we trust each other. And David sends me a scene and then I go, well, that's cool, but I don't understand why he said that here or why she does that. And then he goes, well, gee, I was thinking in the next scene, this was going to happen, but maybe we should rethink where this thing gets unfolded, unpacked. And then I send him scenes as I write them and start to like, well, why are you doing that musically? It's like, well, it's leading up to something that you don't hear yet, but it's a thread. And if he doesn't buy it, I'll go back and rethink it. And that journey back and forth, sending us each other as we develop the work is the most beautiful part of the whole process.
And finally, on this opera, because I want to talk to each of you about other works of yours, the title Lucidity, where'd it come from? Who picked it?
I think I actually, when we knew it was going to be with Lucy, I just said, well, we're calling this Lucidity. And originally she was going to be called Lucy, and that just got too messy. Yeah. So then David proposed Lily, which is beautiful because it's a flower, but he spells it Lili, and that's the quiet reference to Lily Boulanger, the unrecognized composer. So it was just one of those fortuitous things.
I feel like, but it's a marvelously apt title. And I mean, I guess when one thinks of lucidity, one thinks, of course, of in visual terms, in terms of clarity of vision, but of course we were talking about clarity of mind. And it even works for our little lonely shepherd on the rock, because when Laura brought that in and said, "Oh, we should weave this through the piece," and I was like, "Okay, wow." And I got to know the piece and love it, of course. And then that the narrative material within Shepherd on the Rock had to sort of enter the metaphorical economy of the whole piece, and it does brilliantly. It echoes and distance. It's all metaphors for dementia and for Alzheimer's, but also emotional distances as well.
So, again, to remind listeners, let me find the exact information. The presenting company in New York is On Site Opera, a wonderful company that does operas in different settings on site, SITE. It is co-produced with the Seattle Opera and will be then done in the later, you'll tell me the dates, in Seattle, Washington, the state of Washington. And I'm sure that's just the beginning of lots of performances all around the world, the way As One has. But osopera.org is On-Site Opera, and that's how people would find tickets. Dates are November 14th, 15th, and twice on the 16th. So there are 4 performances of the opera in New York, and then it's coming to, do you know when in Seattle?
Yes, in Seattle, it'll be on the 21st, the 22nd, the 23rd, and then a matinee on the 24th.
Of November.
Of November, yes. We're going.
Good. So it will directly, so greetings to everyone in the Pacific Northwest. It'll go directly from New York City to Washington in time for the salmon runs. Now,
and it will be going to Houston in the spring.
Oh, good.
To Opera in the Heights, which
Wonderful
is
company.
One of the partnering companies, and then it will be going to Ithaca and Tri-Cities, but I don't remember the dates.
That's
or if
upstate
they're
New York.
confirmed yet.
Okay.
Upstate New York.
So, Laura, I first encountered the opera As One at its premiere. You may remember we didn't know each other at all then. We didn't know that we had your sister in common. I would have gone anyway, but I was asked by Brooklyn Academy of Music to do the presenting lecture. So I had to learn about the opera without talking to you, but just looking at the score and reading the libretto. And, live and learn. I repeatedly used a word that apparently made sense to me, but not to other people, linguistically. I said transgendered with an ED at the end, and I was corrected by a woman there who said to me that's really not a correct terminology, and I since then have always said transgender. I mention this only because language evolves, and a word that makes perfect sense 20 years ago may not make sense now. But there's something about this particular wonderful opera, As One, with a libretto by Mark Campbell, who's a friend of mine, and Kimberly Reed, that, and by the way, the 2 stars were friends of mine, are friends of mine, Sasha Cook and her husband, who's I'm suddenly forgetting, Kelly Markgraf. And it's a story, I will say it briefly, but then you can talk more about it, of a person who is transgender, who is known initially as Hannah Younger. The character's name is Hannah, and then Hannah Older. In my memory, until I checked it again recently, I had it as Hannah before and Hannah after, which means that memory can play tricks on you. And yes, go ahead.
We originally had no name for this character. We didn't know what to do. And there was a conversation, should there be a boy's name and then a girl's name? Should there be a gender neutral name? How do you address it? Because it's a complicated issue for a trans person. And at one point, BAM said, we need the press release. You've got to tell us who the characters are. And the publisher said, I need the final score. You need to give me this information. And I was sitting with Mark and Kim, and we were workshopping the piece actually with Blythe Gesser, who's playing Dr. Klugman. She created the role because she workshopped the whole piece for us. Then Sasha sang the premiere, and Blythe has sung more As Ones than any other mezzo. So there's a long history there. But Mark said, I think we should call our character Hannah. And it's like, why? He said, it's a beautiful name. I said, okay, it's also a palindrome. So,
yes. Okay.
and I said, let's look up the root of the name, the etymology, and it means a state of grace. So we thought it was perfect for our character.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point we named, and then so it was, should it be Hannah 1 and Hannah 2, or Hannah baritone and Hannah mezzo? And Mark said, let's do Hannah before and after, which is how it was originally done. But things have evolved and language has changed. And what we've come to realize is, maybe not that it was an insensitivity, but it was a sort of not awareness, that Hannah is always Hannah. Hannah wasn't before and after anything. Hannah is one human being who's continuing to evolve. So that's when we came up with younger and older. Hannah,
it must
the
have been
youth,
that
and
he, when
Hannah.
I spoke to him, told me before and after, and that's how that stuck in my head. But in looking up more recent productions around the world, I noticed that the character is, and do you use a pronoun for this character? Hannah, he, she, they, not he.
But... we didn't use they.
Yeah.
I don't think we used he or she. And of course, the role of the teacher is played by the conductor. And so we have that. Please change it based on the gender preference of the conductor of any production. We never use the word transgender in the entire libretto.
Right. And it's, if I recall, it's 75 minutes. It's 15 songs, if I recall.
I think it may be 13, but
13.
Who knows?
Okay.
I don't remember.
And there's sort of 3 sets of the narrative. You can call them acts. It's a 1-act opera, but I, in studying, began to think of it as a 3-act opera with no intermission. And you have
3
that,
parts.
the Flying Dutchman of Butzecker, that's here in good company. But what was the genesis of this? And did you have any sense that this would go on to become the most performed opera in this century that was composed this century?
The answer is I had no idea. I had this desire to, I had not written very much vocal music at all in my life, but I had this aha moment that I decided I needed to make this piece. And it took about a year or 2 before I met Kimberly. And then she and I started working on it conceptually. And then I met Mark, and we realized we were a team. I wanted to tell the story about a trans person having the courage to be their true self. It's basically, this is a piece about authenticity. And the question that it asks is, what is a human being willing to sacrifice to be their truest self, and what do they lose and gain as they go on that exploration to being fully realized as who they are? That's what the piece is about. And I think that that's probably why it's been able to have such a life, because every human being goes through that. It's not just a trans person's story. And it's not the trans story. It is a human story about self-actualization. So I had this idea for a long time, and I had a storyline and it took a while, but at one point I had done a project with Sasha and Kelly in New York. I was the artistic director of a theater on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called Symphony Space, and every year I did a festival. And that year I did a festival called Wall to Wall Behind the Wall, music from the Soviet era. And I had a fellowship to go to St. Petersburg to find music that we probably would not know in this country to program on this festival. And among the things that I discovered, I'll try to be brief, was a set of opera arias and folk songs that had been arranged by Shostakovich to be performed for 1 or 2 voices, violin and cello, as entertainment for the troops on the front lines during the siege of Leningrad. Like, we sent Bob Hope, the Soviets hired Shostakovich. And I got... So I was
same basic thing.
Same thing. And that compendium, the Front Way songs, had not yet been published and distributed internationally, but it had just come out, and I was given access to where it was available. And I brought it back, and I told somebody who was helping to underwrite the festival what I had discovered. Not only did I bring that back, but I brought back a lot of jazz charts. And of course, there was supposedly no jazz because it was decadent Western music, but there was a thriving underground jazz scene. And I brought back propaganda songs in praise of Stalin written in Yiddish that were published in Moscow in 1938. So just like these amazing treasure trove of music that we were going to be producing. And this donor said, well, if you're going to have a singer do these arias, you have to hire Sasha Cook. And I knew nothing about opera. I said, well, who's that? Well, she's this amazing mezzo who just made her Met debut, and she's really got great Russian. Her mother's Russian, her father's a Russian scholar. And I'll make sure that she can be here because she didn't live in New York City. And Sasha called me up and said, I'll do this project, but there's these duets in the back of the book. Could my husband come and join me? Because we never get to sing together. And they showed up, and it was a love affair. And standing backstage is like, I want them to be in this opera that I'm writing. I want them to be the one character. And I was like, they came off, and I said, I have this weird idea, but I'm trying to tell this story. It's basically a monodrama for two voices. If it ever happens, would you do it? And they said yes. And that was kind of the birth of this piece. And then it was a long slog to get to where we ended up.
I got to work with Sasha very early in her career. So we go back, she's not old at all, but we go back a long ways because she began that early. She was a guest on this program in the summer of 2020, and people can go back and look up Fred Plotkin, Sasha Cook, with an E at the end of Cook. And I like to say, not just I like to say this, that there are many singers who are great singers, but there are not many singers who are great artists. And Sasha is a great artist in addition to being a great singer. And it shows on everything she does. Her understanding, her thoroughness, her beautiful voice, of course, but her soul infuses everything that she does. And I've seen her do a vast range of music, from Cherubino to playing Kitty Oppenheimer in John Adams' Dr. Atomic, where she made her Met debut with Gerald Finley and Eric Owens. It was quite a cast. And Alan Gilbert conducting. So it's a remarkable piece, is all I can say. And I, coming to a theater near you, I would like to also say, and it may well be, it's out there as one. It's very much worth seeing. And David, there are two operas that I can talk to you about. One of them that I saw, one of them that I understand you're working on. So we either get The Innocence Project or Atheism. Which one do you want?
Well, atheism is very much in progress. Let's talk about Blind Injustice.
Okay, Blind Injustice, 2019 Cincinnati Opera. It's a company I've collaborated with a lot for many, many years, and it's a wonderful company. It's the second oldest opera company in America after the Metropolitan Opera. Music by Scott Davenport Richards. It's a story I care about very, very deeply. Tell it. How did you get involved? Talk about the story. It's a great opera.
Cincinnati Opera became aware of Mark Godsey's work. Mark is a professor of law at University of Cincinnati and a co-founder of the Ohio Innocence Project. And because
I just want to say that it didn't quite go by. Ohio Innocence Project.
Swallowing my words is terrible.
I heard resistance, and I want to make sure people understand Ohio Innocence Project. Okay.
Ohio, yes. And yeah, of course, what they do is they people reach out to them, people who are in prison who say they're innocent, and the law students and the lawyers who work for the Ohio Innocence Project, they reopen the case and they see if there's something in there that a crack in the case that they can detect, if a witness recanted, or if there was evidence that the police suppressed, or forensic evidence was used to convict somebody that was later deemed bunk science. And then they relitigate the case. of course, the vast majority of cases that they want to relitigate, they can't for various reasons because a witness may be dead. Anyway, so Mark Godsey and the Cincinnati Opera met, and they were very excited to do a project. I got attached to the project early through a composer who was considering the project but then couldn't do it. So then the Cincinnati had a librettist and a director in the form of Robin Guarino, the wonderful Robin Guarino, who co-artistic director of Opera Fusion New Works in Cincinnati. And well, it was a I would say it's a long journey, although it came together in like light speed in terms of opera years, because I think we wrote it in about 2.5 years. But Robin and I interviewed a bunch of exonerees, total of 6 people.
Talk about what that means, because we have an international audience who may not know. It relates to the death penalty in this country.
Mm-hmm.
I can say, because I care about this deeply, that the motor of the innocence movement, while it dates back decades, really happened at Northwestern University in just north of Chicago. And Illinois was one of the first states to pioneer that. And as I recall, the former Republican governor of Illinois abolished the death penalty in Illinois because there are just so many examples of people being put to death because they didn't have a proper defense. DNA would later be produced. Someone would confess later on. Famously, Donald Trump in New York vilified 5 young men who came to be known first as the Central Park 5 because they allegedly committed a crime. Now they're the exonerated 5 because it has been proved that this 1989 crime was done by someone else and not these 5 young men. And Donald Trump at that time took out an ad in the New York Times that the 5 of them should be put to death. So I'm not getting too political here, but New Yorkers have known Donald Trump before the nation knew him. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
Well,
sure
I mean,
have.
that's sort of, tough on crime, hang 'em high sort of attitude towards accused people is politics are very much the heart of these problems of railroading innocent people through trials and convicting them, sometimes, yes, to a death sentence. Judges who are elected in certain areas of the country, they run on tough on crime records, as well as district attorneys, that sort of thing. And in fact, our opera opens with the sort of slightly allegorical figure of the prosecutor addressing the audience and basically identifying himself as the law. I am the law. I keep you safe. I will protect you. Who are these people who rape and murder? They're human garbage, and I'm your garbage man. I take out the garbage. So that was a kind of way of, I don't know, having the devil come out in a sense, mm-hmm. and get everybody on their side. But it was astonishing to meet the real people whose lives had been saved by the Ohio Innocence Project. Ricky Jackson, who was in jail for 39 years. Nancy Smith, who drove a bus for Head Start, who was accused of molesting kids. She was in jail for 14 years. And the East Cleveland three teenagers who were accused of a murder on the street, in jail for 20 years. And Clarence Elkins, who was accused of raping and murdering his mother-in-law, but none of his DNA was at the site of the crime, but the DNA to the actual rapist and murderer was. So it was a fascinating deep dive into an area I did not know a lot about, and then working with Scott Davenport Richards, an amazing composer who is writing in various idioms: jazz, classical opera, or traditional opera, I should say, and sort of musical theater forms as well. So it's an amazingly rich and varied score. And yeah, I mean, it's wonderful to make art that's also kind of hopefully good for the world, mm-hmm. And aesthetically pleasing at the same time. It's interesting. It's like what's the drama, of course, is to see these people plucked out of their lives, imprisoned, and having to survive in jail, and then finally be freed. So it's a what can I say? It was a big responsibility to get it right and to get the blessing of all the exonerees as well. in how we
I want to
depict.
mention something that Carnegie Hall has pioneered, and Carnegie Hall here in New York City has wonderful, original, innovative outreach. I don't want to say not just arts in the schools because it's incredibly important, but arts in all kinds of places. And they've worked on a program in which musicians, singers primarily, go to New York State prisons and sing with, work with prisoners, help them compose. Primarily two artists, Joyce DiDonato, the mezzo soprano, and Eric Owens, the bass baritone, have been very active in this, and I'm very proud of them. And I think it's wonderful the way Carnegie Hall does that, because, we were talking before about, forgive the metaphor, the prison of dementia, but there's also the prison that is prison, that you actually have walls around you and bars that seal you in, and a little bit of light, not much lucidity, and it affects the mind in other ways. And it's been wonderful what these artists through Carnegie Hall have been doing. So that's just my pitch for that. We're going to conclude soon, but I do ask my guests to always give me musical selections from my dojo that they like. These will be posted, but you each had two composers in common, two whom I love. One of them we mentioned before, Dmitri Shostakovich, the Bob Hope of the Soviet Union. and Laura, you specifically mentioned, you said any string quartet, but specifically the eighth, which is far and away my favorite of his, I think, 15 string quartets, if I remember. Why the eighth string quartet of Shostakovich, Laura?
The depth of that piece is so profound. He wrote that in about 2 weeks. It was dedicated to the victims of fascism and war. He had just, if I'm remembering my history, been forced to join the Communist Party, and this was sort of his way of speaking out for right. And the urgency and the power of the music, the concision of it is just, it's just extraordinarily perfect. It's perfect music.
Yeah.
I mean, it just, I don't think there's anything more I can say about it.
I agree. It's a perfect piece of music. And yeah, one could name many, but this is an unexpected place to find it, I think. We would tend to think of Mozart, but the Shostakovich Eighth String Quartet is really rather magnificent. And David, you named me a couple of pieces, the Piano Trio No. 2 by Shostakovich, but also the opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, or the Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District, as it's sometimes known. Why those?
Sentimental reasons, I suppose. The composer Stefan Weissman introduced me to Shostakovich at Bard a few hundred years ago.
Bard College. Yep.
Yeah, Bard College, yes, in upstate New York. And I just was electrified by this music. I heard a live performance of Piano Trio No. 2 while at Bard. I think it might have even been Da Capo chamber players doing it. And it's just it's somewhat like Laura's selection. It's a piece that was inspired by horrors. Supposedly he heard that it was composed during World War II, and Shostakovich had heard that Nazi soldiers were forcing Jewish prisoners to dance before shooting them. Very grim, very horrifying. And so the music has a kind of mad dance figure in it, a melody, which is it could be maybe vaguely klezmer influence, perhaps. And it's just a furious piece that is, I find, terrifying. And it's like a witch's Sabbath. It's a terrifying piece, and so much great music, of course, is dance based, or inspires feelings of dance, like Bach or Mozart. It makes you want to move, and of course that is a horrifying transmutation of that impulse with Shostakovich.
There's also a lamentation quality in this piece, in the trio, which was my other Shostakovich choice. Because he wrote it upon the learning of the death of a very close friend of his, the cellist, Ivan Solinsky, I think his name was. And so he was devastated on a very personal level, as well as on a global citizen in a broken world level. And so the power, the pathos of both kinds of losses and anguish come through in both lamentation and dance in the trio.
Which I would add my favorite. I love the pieces you chose. I would also add, very late in his life, he composed songs based on poems of Michelangelo. And these are about being an artist, about the creative life, about love, about loss, about despair, about the whole range of human emotions. And these were written in Italian, of course, but translated to Russian. And couched in this, it was the early to mid 1970s when he wrote them, is that it was still very much the Soviet Union. There was a different kind of repression from the Stalin era, but nonetheless, it was pretty strong. And so each of the feelings that are dealt with in these songs were ones that Shostakovich felt as a man, as a dying man, as an artist. But he didn't have to underline it because Michelangelo did the work in terms of the words, and Shostakovich did it in terms of the music. They're brilliant, brilliant pieces. The other composer that you picked in common, Stephen Sondheim. And David, you wrote specifically the original Sweeney Todd, Assassins, or Sunday in the Park with George. Laura, you wrote anything by Sondheim.
Yeah, pretty much.
Now in Follies, you have the singer Lucy Shelton. There's the ballad of Lucy and Jessie. Do you know that? Maybe my favorite Sondheim song of all. And let's see if I can remember the lyric. Lucy is juicy but terribly drab. Jessie is dressy but cold as a slab. Lucy wants to be Jessie. Jessie wants to be Lucy. That's the sorrowful pressy. It's very messy. You see Lucy's a lassie. You pat on the head. Jessie is sassy but virtually dead. And on and on and on and on and on. And what it is a woman revealing her two sides. And within her live Lucy and Jessie. And it's just a brilliant show-stopping number, the show Follies, that is so full of great music that people forget that song. And but I think it's a masterpiece. But why, starting with Laura, why anything by Stephen Sondheim? I mean, is there any particular song or work that you particularly feel?
Yes. I mean, I will actually have to confess, I have not seen all of his shows live in a theater. I kind of grew up with my family listening on Saturday nights. We'd all gather and listen to records and sing along. And the range of what we listened to was pretty broad, but at a certain point, there was just a lot of Sondheim. So I know songs, but sort of out of context of a full theatrical production. The ballads just break my heart. The really clever, like the one you just gave, the really clever patter songs, something I could probably never achieve and wouldn't even attempt. They're brilliantly executed, but just, I really can't say, because I'm just going to get choked up, because there's just so many beautiful songs that just, I hear the first two chords and they make
Well, let me ask you, as a composer, a lot of people, I'm not saying I agree or disagree, have said, well, brilliant lyrics, but the music is just there to sort of support the lyrics rather than being great music.
That's kind of what you want, is the music supports the lyrics and lets the emotional content of the story that's being told and the brilliance of the words soar. And he has an economical way of using his material, but it's always right. I mean, he quote, just like Shostakovich, just like Bach, like all the greats, he quotes himself all over the place. And those are the signature Sondheim-esque bits that define his style. And, the question mark fifths, the rotating back and forth, it's just the open chords, it's just beautiful, well supportive music of the story that's being told.
And there's also the fact, of course, that we're taking for granted, but people may not think of, that he wrote his own words and the music, so that he has that in common with Wagner, with Berlioz, and not too many other composers who wrote all of their own words. He wrote practically all of his own words. And I never met him. I would have asked him which came first, the words or the music. I would guess the words, but I could be completely wrong.
Or did they arrive sort of, on each other's heels? Yeah.
David, do you have among you mentioned Sweeney Todd Assassins and Sunday in the Park with George. Talk about those three musicals.
Well, I mean, Sweeney Todd is the I don't want to single any of them out too much, but it is the Everest. It is a masterpiece, and musically thrilling. I mean, if you want to call it a tragic operetta, you could do that, I suppose. But it's just so rich musically, and how he weaves the God of Wrath.
Dies Irae.
Yeah,
thank you, Dies Irae. My Latin's a bit rusty today. Is just so clever and masterful, and of course he's always Sondheim's always working with a musical concept that's not just I'm going to write big beautiful music. It's variations on Hail to the Chief in Assassins. It's variations on waltzes and little night music, and Dies Irae in Sweeney Todd, as well as sort of Victorian musical forms. So, I mean, I love the darkness in Sondheim. I love the in Assassins, which was my gateway musical in college. I was very stupid in college. I had to have people open my eyes and ears to things.
It's good that you were open to that.
Yes, no, and I mean, and then of course, just as a person who loves language and loves rhyme and loves prosody, I fell in love with Sondheim's work, and a song like Sunday at the end of Act 1 of Sunday in the Park with George.
Oh God,
it's holy stuff. It's holy stuff. And my one time getting to interview the master, he explained to me that the musical cue for that is maestoso. He introduced me to the term maestoso, which of course means kind of mysterious or a lot of
more majestic.
Majestic.
Yeah.
I was working on an essay about Sondheim and anthems, which he sort of pointed out to me. He doesn't really write anthems, but yes, Sondheim just gets me in the heart and brain every time. I love his work.
Yeah.
David, I think that may be the most concise way to describe the genius, is that it simultaneously fires in your heart and your brain. And I think that's true. I mean, and you asked Fred, like, which song, and like, there were just like, all of them were like flooding me and I couldn't think of any, but given that we started off talking about lucidity, one of my favorites is Losing My Mind.
Yeah. A ballad from Follies, which I won't say because I never met him and asked him, but apparently it was sort of an incidental number in a larger thing, but not the number. But it has come to be, along with Send in the Clowns, perhaps his most famous single song that's most sung elsewhere. But in that show, it's kind of, to me, in Follies, it's kind of like, which is my favorite Sondheim musical, that depending how you pitch it, it's like a cut faceted diamond. If you turn it a little differently, different light reflects, and suddenly one of the characters, Phyllis, becomes more important, or one of the others becomes more important, depending which one it is at a given moment. My favorite number from the show, even though I love the Ballad of Lucy and Jessie, is called Who's That Woman? Because Who's That Woman is about past, present, and future. Each day I see her pass in my looking glass. Lord, 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 that woman is me. And it was staged by Harold Prince and Michael Bennett with mirrors that turned, and suddenly women appeared from the past who were the younger versions of the women we're seeing now. And brilliant staging that didn't overdo it, knockout music, of the old Broadway belted style that he could write very well. Yeah, I don't know if people always realize, even though Sondheim had a great deal of acclaim in his lifetime, that when we're living in the same time as someone like that and we get to see his works, how historic that is. That we are witnesses to this and to what he did, and there's a cult around him. I won't say he's my favorite musical composer of Broadway musicals, but I love almost everything he did. And to me, Follies may be the greatest musical ever written. And imperfect though it is, the book is not great. David, you have to come back and fix it.
No, nowhere near that. I have no. And not to force a segue, but I mean, what you talked about with Who's That Woman? I would just say that our director, Sarah Myers, who's doing Lucidity at the Abrams Arts Center, placing the audience on the stage so that the house of the theater is the site of the action. She's also going to be evoking in shadows and light, memory, the past, all those wonderful, all those wonderful things of life that we all go through when we get older and we look back in the past and through the mists of time and all that. And it's going to be, I'm just really excited to see what she does. I mean, Follies was inspired by a picture that Sondheim saw of, I don't remember the name of the actress.
Theater being destroyed. Also, the theater being destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah.
The theater, right. And an actress standing in its ruins looking glamorous. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this was a wonderful conversation. Laura Kaminsky, David Cote. I look very much forward. Let's put it this way, based on the work of yours that I know already, I know this will be terrific. Lucidity should shine for a long time to come. And I'm very happy that I'll be going to the first performances. And I commend it to people in New York, in Seattle, in Houston, and wherever else Lucidity will appear. You do want to go see it. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you so much.
It was a lovely conversation. Thank you, Fred.